What if I told you America was never discovered? That when Europeans arrived, they didn't find an empty wilderness, but a continent already alive with cities, trade routes, diplomacy, and millions of people? For centuries, we've been told a simple story: brave explorers, a new world, a fresh beginning. But the real story is far more complicated and far more human. Long before 1492, North America was not a blank map. It was home to vast civilizations. Along the Mississippi River stood Cahokia, a city larger than London at the time, with towering earthen pyramids and complex political systems. In the southwest, the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples engineered entire communities into cliffs. Across the eastern woodlands, confederacies like the Haudenosaunee, later known as the Iroquois, built sophisticated alliances that some historians believe influenced early American democratic ideas. This was not wilderness. This was a world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west, searching not for a new continent, but for a shortcut to Asia. He never set foot on what is now the United States. Yet his arrival in the Caribbean ignited something unstoppable. Within decades, Spanish expeditions pushed northward. They came searching for gold, land, and souls to convert. Missions were built across Florida and the Southwest. Some indigenous communities formed alliances for survival. Others resisted fiercely. Few people realized that one of the first European settlements in what is now the United States was Spanish, not English. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, still stands as the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the country. Colonization wasn't just about planting flags. It was about survival and power. In 1607, English settlers arrived in Jamestown expecting riches. Instead, they faced starvation. The winter of 1609 became known as the Starving Time. Out of roughly 500 colonists, only about 60 survived. Archaeological evidence suggests desperation reached unimaginable levels. This was not a glorious beginning. It was a fragile foothold. Jamestown survived largely because of indigenous knowledge. The Powhatan Confederacy taught settlers how to grow maize and survive the unfamiliar land. And in the center of that uneasy relationship stood Pocahontas, not the legend, but a young girl around 11 or 12 years old, caught between two worlds. She was later taken hostage, converted to Christianity, married to John Rolfe, and brought to England as proof that colonization was working. She died there at just 21. Her life was not a fairy tale. It was diplomacy under pressure. In 1620, the Mayflower arrived carrying pilgrims seeking religious freedom. But they were also backed by investors. Colonization was a business venture. Land meant profit. The famous First Thanksgiving occurred during a fragile alliance shaped partly by disease that had already devastated native communities years before the Pilgrims arrived. Epidemics, brought unintentionally by Europeans, spread across the continent ahead of permanent settlements. Entire villages disappeared before ever seeing a colonist face to face. Communities collapsed from invisible illnesses they had no immunity against. The balance of power shifted long before muskets dominated the land. Colonization began not only with conquest, but with contact, with misunderstanding, trade, faith, fear, and disease. As English, Spanish, French, and Dutch interests expanded, the continent became a chessboard of competing empires. Native nations were not passive victims in this story. They negotiated, resisted, and adapted. Some strategically aligned with one European power against another to protect their people. This was not a simple story of newcomers overpowering the powerless. It was a collision of worlds, political, spiritual, economic, reshaping an entire hemisphere. And this was only the beginning. By the mid-1600s, colonization had changed. It was no longer just survival. It became structured expansion. Land hunger intensified. So did labor demands. In 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying captive Africans. While Spain and Portugal had enslaved millions in the Americas long before, this marked the beginning of race-based slavery becoming deeply embedded in English North America. Early on, social lines were not fully hardened. Some Africans gained freedom, and many Europeans worked as indentured servants. But over time, colonial laws solidified racial hierarchy. Skin color became a permanent boundary. Colonization was not only about claiming territory, it was about building an economic engine fueled by tobacco, rice, and forced labor. Meanwhile, native nations fought to defend their homelands. In 1675, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, led one of the most devastating uprisings in New England history. For over a year, violence engulfed the region. Colonists feared their settlements might collapse entirely. In the end, Metacom was killed, and his death symbolized a turning point. After this war, colonial expansion grew more aggressive, and coexistence became less common. The French strengthened trade networks in the Great Lakes region. The Spanish expanded missions across California. The Dutch traded along the Hudson River before losing New Amsterdam to the English, who renamed it New York. Colonization was never a single story. It was multiple empires competing for land, wealth, and influence. By the 1700s, 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Yet they were far from united. Their economies differed. Their religious practices differed. Their political priorities differed. Many colonists still identified strongly as British subjects. But imperial policies began to strain that relationship. Taxes, trade restrictions, and military presence sparked new questions. What does representation mean? Who has the right to govern? Who truly owns the land? Calls for liberty grew louder. Yet even as ideas of freedom expanded, slavery deepened. Even as colonists protested British control, native lands continued to be seized further west. The American Revolution would eventually break political ties with Britain, but it did not end colonization. It transformed it. The newly formed United States continued pushing westward. Treaties were signed and repeatedly broken. Expansion became national policy. Indigenous nations were displaced, and new territories were absorbed into a growing republic. Colonization was not a single voyage in 1492. It was a centuries-long process shaped by ambition, faith, survival, disease, resistance, and relentless expansion. It was shaped by explorers and monarchs, but also by ordinary people. Starving settlers in Jamestown, native leaders making impossible decisions, African families forced across the Atlantic, and children like Pocahontas caught between cultures. The America that emerged was not inevitable. It was built through encounters, some cooperative, some tragic, that reshaped identities on both sides of the ocean. So perhaps the real question isn't who discovered America. Perhaps the question is whose stories were simplified, whose voices were silenced, and whose experiences were left out of the narrative. History is not just dates and declarations. It is memory, power, and perspective. Colonization created the foundations of modern America. But understanding how it truly happened requires looking beyond the myth and recognizing the many worlds that collided to create one nation.